Nobody knows the truth about the person who had more spending power than just about anyone on Earth. He's one of the most wanted men in the world. In his 20s, he pulled off one of the biggest scams in history by stealing around $4.5 billion, and that money wasn't even tied up in assets. This was liquid cash which he could spend. This is Joe Lo, who probably had more spending power than anyone else on Earth, and boy did he enjoy that money. Joe Lo built a reputation as the person who did extravagant spending in casinos and nightclubs, often wasting hundreds and thousands of dollars on drinks per night. He lived an extravagant life of lavish spending on party and luxury, and bought private jets and mansions and Picasso artworks. His life in actual resembled something out of The Wolf of Wall Street, which is ironic, because Joe Lo was the one who financed that movie. Irony is that he used stolen money from his financial scam to fund the Hollywood blockbuster about a financial scam. But how does a guy born on a small Malaysian island end up becoming friends with Hollywood stars, dating supermodels, and pulling off one of the biggest financial frauds ever? Welcome to this crazy but true story of Joe Lo. Joe was born in the Malaysian island of Penang, but in 1998, his life took a turn when his parents sent him to Harrow, a prestigious boarding school in England, where he built the core foundation of context for the future because Joe Lo's family was wealthy, but many of Joe's classmates at Harrow were a whole different level of wealth. Many of them were children from royal families or oil magnates. So, whilst Joe was the son of a millionaire, many of the kids he was hanging around with were the sons of billionaires. But Joe Lo saw an opportunity here and tried to build friendships with some of these extremely wealthy students. So, just to impress his friends and make them believe that he was as rich as his friends, he invited them to spend a summer in Malaysia, and he then borrowed a 160-foot yacht from a rich family friend and pretended it was his own yacht by changing all the family photos on board with the pictures of him. From a very young age, Joe Lo also tried to position himself as a person who could get stuff done for people. He once managed to get the letterhead of the Brunei embassy and forced a letter to a very famous nightclub in the West End asking if they could preserve a VIP table by pretending he was a member of the Brunei royal family. And it worked. He, along with his underage friends, went partying alongside famous football players and models in this high-end nightclub. Joe Lo experienced this lesson at an early stage that the appearance of power and prestige could unlock all kinds of doors. After Harrow, Joe Lo went to Wharton University in America, and he was continually trying to build his personal brands. For example, he wrote articles on stocks for the Wharton Journal, his university's newspaper. However, Joe was just plagiarizing reports written by Wall Street analysts and pretending they were his own. But somehow nobody noticed, and thus he developed a reputation as a great stock picker, when in actual, he had no experience. Joe Lo also drove a Lexus convertible around campus, claiming to be his car, but was really just leasing, and deliberately didn't correct rumors that he was a prince of Malaysia. Joe Lo was essentially building a persona and disguising himself as some royal to help get him in the right social circles. Even at university, he pursued friendships with the wealthiest students, just like he'd done at Harrow. Joe Lo's amazing ability to network so well would ultimately help him to pull off one of the greatest financial heists ever. So whilst at university, Joe Lo decided to throw a grandeur party for his birthday, and he out an exclusive nightclub with an open bar and sent out invites with his name written in large fonts. To him, this party was more of an investment. He wanted to appear successful and be remembered by everyone. So, he made sure the whole event had a very exclusive feel to it, and every attendee felt important. No one realized that Joe had only put down a deposit for the party, and after the event, he was stalling on paying the club owners the rest of the money that they've been promised. Though Joe Lo regularly received money from his father, but he was not rich enough money to pay for this magnificence. So he ended up stalling for months and eventually negotiating a massive discount with the club owners. But it didn't matter, as no one knew the truth and assumed that he was as rich as he said he was. Joe Lo by now fully bought into the idea that it's not just what you know, it's who you know, and he was happy to lie about himself and his wealth just to be with the right kind of people. Using these new connections, Jolo managed to persuade some of his Arab friends to set up a tour around the Middle East, where he then met with some of the richest families and made more influential connections, including some minor royals. One of them later revealed how Jolo seemed particularly interested about power structures in the Middle East, that he seemed to be trying to understand who controlled the money in each country. However, one of the most important connections of all that Jolo made was with the people who ran Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth funds. Now, what exactly is the sovereign wealth fund? Well, it's essentially a giant pool of money that's controlled by a nation's government. Most commonly, they're used by countries that are dependent on a single resource, like countries in the Middle East, whose economies are highly dependent on oil, and they use these funds to diversify their money into other assets and investments. However, these are mostly unregulated with very little transparency or oversights, and that's why they would be crucial for Jolo's future schemes. So after this trip and graduating from university, Jolo set up his own company, which he called the Winton Group. According to him, the name was chosen because he was going to win tons of money. Now, the basic idea behind the company was that he'd broker deals between Middle Eastern investors who wanted to get involved in projects in Malaysia. So the first step by Jolo was to get luxurious offices for his new company in the famous Patronus Towers, which he couldn't really afford, but he managed to arrange a loan from a local bank because Joe knew the importance of giving the perception of a serious and successful business. Of course, he now needed some actual clients, and luckily, all of his networking with wealthy elites was about to start paying off in a very major way. One of Jolo's best friends from his days at Harrow was Riza Aziz, who was the stepson of a prominent Malaysian government official called Najib Razak. In fact, by the time Jolo had started his company up, Najib became Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, which obviously meant he had a lot of power. And Jolo badly wanted to take advantage of this opportunity, only if he could get inside Najib's circle, as just being good friends with Najib's stepson wasn't enough by itself. Jolo had to prove his value, and that's when he heard that Malaysia was looking for partners to develop a giant construction project. The idea for it was basically to build a financial and lifestyle center similar to Singapore, but they needed investors. Jolo saw an opportunity here. Using the wealthy connections he'd made in the Middle East, he was able to broker a deal where they would invest in Malaysia's construction projects. But here's the epic part. Jolo let Najib, Malaysia's Deputy Prime Minister, take all the credit for the deal, despite not having to do any of the work. Jolo certainly knew how and when to grab the opportunity and build a reputation. This made Najib very popular among the Malaysian people, as he was now seen as a politician who could attract big investments and help propel Malaysia forwards. In fact, this popularity was one of the major factors in helping him become Prime Minister of Malaysia in 2009. Now, John is expected to simply get a fee for the deal, but instead, he received something bigger and better. He was now loved by Najib, who was extremely grateful to Jolo. And so, in 2009, when Najib became Prime Minister of Malaysia, now Jolo, who at this point was just 27 years old, now had the ear of the most powerful man in the country, and he didn't stop there. He made his ties more stronger with Najib's family by gifting Najib's wife expensive jewelry, and even paid for Najib's daughter college tuition, as well as attending her graduation ceremony. By this point, Najib trusted Joe fully, and Joe wasted no time in approaching him with an idea that Malaysia should create their own sovereign wealth funds, similar to the ones in the Middle East, which could be used to invest all around the world. And so together, they set up the One Malaysia Development Berhad, or the 1MDB Fund. Now, officially, the 1MDB Fund was supposed to develop the country's economy by investing in green energy and tourism and create high-quality jobs for all Malaysians. Now, Joe persuaded Najib to put him in charge of the fund, as in that way, they could use some of the money as a war chest to fund certain political goals. For example, the fund could be used for Najib to host big events or to build affordable housing in areas as a way to get more of the country loyal to him. Joe had the Malaysian Prime Minister in the palm of his hands. He'd helped Najib get elected, and now he was proposing a deal to help Najib consolidate power even further. To Najib, the whole idea seemed like a win-win, so he let Jolo run the 1MDB Fund and do whatever he wanted with blind trust on him. Officially, Najib had the title of the fund's chairman, whilst Jolo was simply classed as an advisor, but in actual, Jolo controlled the whole fund, and he hired people he knew well as staff who were blindly loyal to him, meaning Jolo essentially had full control over what to do with Malaysia's billion-dollar fund. Within a couple of months, Joe had found the first deal for the 1MDB fund to invest. He again used his connections in Saudi Arabia and arranged a joint venture with the oil company PetroSaudi. The plan was that 1MDB would invest $1 billion into this oil project, which was basically all the money in the fund at the time. Now, Joe got permission from Najib to transfer the money from 1MDBs. However, Joe, now fully in charge, carried out his first scam here. He actually only sent $300 million to the joint venture account with PetroSaudi, whilst the remaining $700 million went to a company called Goodstar Limited, which had a bank account in Switzerland. Jolo claimed that Goodstar Limited was a company owned by the Saudis, who had to pay the debt to this company before the joint venture could continue. But this wasn't true, as this Goodstar Limited was merely a shell company, and it used something called bearer shares. Now, with normal shares in a company, they'd be registered to an invent name, and there'd be a registry of who owns shares in the company. However, a bearish heir is a type of share where whoever holds the physical share certificates has full ownership of it, thus making it very hard to tell who really owns the company, and therefore making it very useful for frauds. In the case of Goodstar Limited, it was later revealed that there was only one physical share, and that share was held by Joe Low. So, on paper, it seemed like 1MDB had simply invested in the PetroSaudi joint venture as planned. But in actual, Joe Low now owned those $700 million. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning to get to this position of power in the first place that had made it possible from an early age. Jolo had been actively seeking the right connections and then providing value to those connections. In order to cultivate such an influential and powerful network who trusted him, he'd identified sovereign wealth funds as a taller than it could be easily exploited. Joe just had to bribe a few senior people for their silence, but that wasn't hard to do, since he just got $700 million and had deliberately surrounded himself with loyal yes men and used friends in high-ranking positions to make sure nobody questioned anything. Now it was the time for the real fun to begin, and with so much liquid cash, he could do whatever he wanted with it. So, with all his stolen money, Jolo began living a life of luxury. He went on a spending spree of yachts, mansions, and sports cars. He even bought a big hotel in Beverly Hills, but most nights, you'd find Jolo an exclusive nightclub or casino. In fact, it's reported that in the 8 months between October 2009 and June 2010, Jolo and his friends spent around $85 million on private jets, alcohol gambling, and paying models and Hollywood celebrities to party with them. It was non-stop partying and networking. You see, John realized he could use the money from 1MDB to get close to the rich and famous and build an even greater reputation for himself. And thus he put the word out into show business circles that he was happy to pay celebs over $100,000 a night to attend his parties. Even to rich celebrities, they'd never seen anything quite like Jolo's levels of spending. This was a whole different level of rich. He'd lose $1 million in a game of poker and wouldn't seem to care. As a result, Jolo got to meet all kinds of famous people. He was regularly hanging out with Paris Hilton. There's also stories of Jolo being in a Las Vegas hotel suite with Leonardo DiCaprio, surrounded by 20 Playboy bunnies. Jolo would also buy out prestigious clubs and then throw secret parties with friends and celebrities. He'd give out incredibly expensive gifts, like he gave Kim Kardashian a white Ferrari for a wedding, and he'd casually hand out designer bags that cost tens of thousands of dollars to people he'd literally just met. And to be fair, Jolo threw some of the biggest parties imaginable. There was one particular party he threw in Vegas for his birthday that felt more like a major concert, had all kinds of celebrities, including Kanye West, Bradley Cooper, Robert De Niro, Michael Phelps, Kim Kardashian, Paris Hilton, and even Psy was there to in Gangnam Style. Oh, and he even got Britney Spears to burst out of a cake to serenade him by singing Happy Birthday. That single night is rumored to have cost tens of millions of dollars. Most of the celebrities at these events were often being paid to be there. The truth is, even the biggest stars didn't turn down hundreds of thousands of dollars to attend an event. However, they had to admit, Jolo knew how to throw an amazing party, and he felt that if his parties were successful, his own status would grow, helping him attract even more powerful people into his life, and he was indeed getting a reputation. When newspapers heard he'd sent 23 bottles to Lindsay Lohan's table on a night out, they dubbed him the big spending Malaysian, the mystery man of the city club scene, and being surrounded by celebrities of course raised Jolo's profile further. And at one point, he reportedly dated the model Miranda Kerr, who he showered with expensive gifts. But the insanity didn't stop there. He went to the extent that Joe, along with some friends and celebrities, celebrated New Year twice, first in Sydney, Australia, and later flying back in his private jet back to Las Vegas and to celebrate the countdown to midnight a second time in the same night. There was also another incident where Jolo got into a bidding war with someone for a bottle of champagne and ended up spending 2 million euros on it. Some even started calling Jolo the Asian Great Gatsby, but this wasn't just a reference to him throwing so many extravagant parties. It was also because Jolo seemed to observe his own parties rather than be actively involved in them. He was more of an observer and repeatedly kept checking with people if they were having a good time and enjoying it, rather than actually enjoying it himself. Many of his guests tried to speak with him, but the conversations never seemed to get very far beyond small talk. He actually seemed quite shy, but he clearly was a people pleaser. His parties were ultimately about the pretense of wealth, prestige, and status. However, even back then, very little data was available on Google about Jolo. He was a mysterious character for most of the people who thought him to be an arms dealer or a royal. Jolo's closest friends nicknamed him Panda because he was plump. For years, Jolo methodically cultivated relationships with the wealthiest and most powerful people on the planet, but also tried to learn what motivated them and see how he could assist them. So far, the stolen money from 1MDB had been spent on the lavish lifestyle of Jolo, along with some of it going to a political slush fund for Najib, the Malaysian Prime Minister, but Jolo now wanted to use some of the money to start a legitimate business. So he decided to get involved in Hollywood himself and helped fund a production company called Red Granite Pictures. Just like with the 1MDB fund, Joe didn't take an official title at the company as he didn't want records of his involvements. He preferred to be the secret money man behind it, having an active role from the shadows. This is the time when Jolo financed The Wolf of Wall Street, though his production company, when DiCaprio and Scorsese couldn't get any of the major Hollywood studios to give them the $100 million budget they needed to make the film. As a result, Jolo himself was personally named in the film's credit. Plus, when Leo won a Golden Globe for his role in the movie, he gave Jolo a shout-out in his acceptance speech. Now, the real-life guy that The Wolf of Wall Street is based on is Jordan Belfort, who didn't trust Jolo at all. Belfort was invited to one of Jonah's parties to celebrate them, buying the rights to his story. However, Belfort commented that something didn't seem right when he saw how overly extravagant the event was, and he said, "You wouldn't spend money you work for like that. This has got to be stolen." However, most people around were happy not to ask too many questions, and so Jolo's company later acquired a stake in EMI Music Publishing, and he even joined the firm's advisory boards. Between the Wolf of Wall Street movie and the EMI deal, Jonah was putting himself on the map as more than just a guy who threw big parties. Jolo's intention now was to build a media empire to become a legitimate profitable business. Jolo figured eventually he might be making so much money from his media projects that he could repay the money he'd taken out of the 1MDB funds at the very least. For sure, he knew he needed income to afford and maintain his very luxurious lifestyle. The problem was Jolo had a compulsion to keep spending and acquiring more and more. He wanted to keep making things bigger and crazier, and so Joe realized he was going to need more money fast, which meant it was time to steal some more. Tim Leisner was head of Goldman Sachs' Asia division, and Jolo had been wooing him. He'd arranged for a private jet to come and pick him up, and then taken him to a meeting with one of the richest sheiks in the world. After giving Tim an extremely luxurious trip, Jonah explained his intentions that he wanted Goldman Sachs to help 1MDB raise more money through bond sales. The truth was that Jolo knew that they needed the credibility of a big Wall Street bank like Goldman Sachs to ensure the whole thing looked legitimate. So they made a deal where Goldman Sachs would issue a bond and sell that bond to investors. Now, investors were told that their money would help pay for power plants, but the problem was that 1MDB had no credit rating, which made it very hard to convince people to invest. So, to make the power plant deals look better, Goldman Sachs used their credibility and paired 1MDB up with Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund, which had $70 billion in assets and solid credits. Suddenly, the package looked much more enticing to investors. 1MDB by itself wasn't that appealing. But when 1MDB mixed with Abu Dhabi's wealth fund plus with Goldman Sachs involved, that was enough for investors to buy into these bonds. In 2012, 1MDB issued $3.5 billion in bonds through Goldman Sachs. But as the official fund manager, Joe Low used his old offshore tricks that he'd used before and diverted $1.4 billion of that money to an offshore company registered in the British Virgin Islands, which was another tax haven. Then in 2013, when 1MDB issued $3 billion more bonds through Goldman Sachs, he once again diverted some of the funds through offshore accounts. He also used some of that money to pay off everyone who had helped him pull this off, including Tim Leissner from Goldman Sachs, but the rest was Joe Low. So instead of that investor money going to power plants as advertised, Joe Low now had billions of dollars in his offshore accounts, which allowed his crazy spending to continue. A big kickback also went to Najib to keep the prime minister happy and make sure he didn't ask too many questions. Plus, Joe figured the money from the bond sales would help cover 1MDB's growing losses. As for Goldman Sachs, they got around $600 million in fees and revenue, which reporters later said is around 200 times more than they'd usually make on a deal about size, indicating they knew full well something very shady was going on, but didn't ask any questions in return for a big payout. But still, how did Joe Low actually manage to siphon off billions of dollars for himself? One of the strategy was setting up bank accounts under fake company names that resembled real firms. For example, they created a shell company called BlackRock Commodities Global Limited, which sounds just like the giant global investment company BlackRock. So it was easy for anyone looking at the transaction to assume the money was being sent to genuine big companies. So it didn't raise any obvious red flags, when in reality, they were just fake shell companies with very similar names. Another strategy Joe used is called layering, moving funds from one offshore bank account to another, making them look like real transactions or loans, and adding layers of complexity until the original source of the funds is hidden. It's very hard to track these offshore accounts registered in tax havens. Joe Low also had another scheme where he transferred money to trust accounts at US law firms because client confidentiality rules in the US. I mean, those accounts are hardly regulated. But most important of all, Joe Low was able to pull this off because he knew that transactions between governments attracted a lot less scrutiny from auditors and banks. Government funds are simply not as transparent as with a regular company. As a result of all this, it's estimated in total that around $4.5 billion was stolen from 1MDB by Joe. Of course, Najib, the Malaysian Prime Minister, knew full well that 1MDB wasn't as legitimate as it seems because he was receiving secret money from the fund for his own political ambitions. However, Joe Low had promised him that the fund would enhance relationships with the Middle East and help bring investment and developments in Malaysia. So Najib didn't think Joe Low would literally just steal so much of the money. But giving Joe Low completely unquestionable authority over a multi-billion-dollar fund was a big mistake. The reason he had the Prime Minister on his side was that Joe Low was still funding a lot of that stolen money into financing the Najib's political campaigns, including money to throw massive events or give to charity to make Najib look good. Now back in Malaysia, people were starting to ask more questions about the 1MDB funds, like what was happening with all that money? Why wasn't Malaysia getting all the developments they'd been promised? So 1MDB continued to burn through money. In fact, it went several billions of dollars into debt, and then in 2015, a whistleblower leaked emails to the press, which included key information bringing Joe Low's schemes to light and help the world realize the full scale of the scam Joe Low had pulled off. Protests broke by hundreds of thousands of Malaysian citizens and demanded that Najib resign for his involvement, but he didn't resign. Najib thought by the time of the next election, it would have all blown over. For Joe Low, as allegations about what he'd done started to come out in the media in 2015, he went into hiding with vast amounts of cash. So he'd still be able to live an extremely comfortable life, but an isolated one, which he hated. He didn't even like being by himself in his room. It was also around this time that his girlfriend Miranda Kerr broke up with him. Then in May 2018, Najib had a shock election defeat and was voted out, with his party losing for the first time in 60 years. In fact, it was the first regime change in Malaysia's entire history, which just shows how much angry the Malaysian people were at the corruption that had taken place. Right after the election, Najib and his wife attempted to flee the country, but protesters at the airport stopped them. Najib claimed he was simply leaving the country for a golf trip, but it was obvious Najib knew what was coming. Now that he was no longer in power, shortly after, this police raided Najib's house and found $274 million worth of goods, including endless amounts of expensive jewelry, handbags, tiaras, and watches, along with $28 million in cash. It was clear Najib had been bribed. Anti-corruption officials arrested the former prime minister in his mansion. He was convicted of multiple crimes and sentenced to 12 years in prison, but he's currently appealing claim these were all genuine political donations, and in the meantime, he's still part of the representative arm of the government. But as for Joe Low, he was long gone. He disappeared. Some sources suggested he'd gone to live in China and could be residing in a villa owned by a high-ranking Chinese party official. There's even reports he was briefly spotted at a Victoria's Secret party in Shanghai, suggesting he's still trying to live out the party lifestyle, albeit much more low-key than he would want. As for Tim Leisner, the ex-Goldman Sachs manager who helped 1MDB, he pled guilty to conspiracy to commit bribery and money laundering, whilst Goldman Sachs tried to say it was just a few rogue employees who'd been involved in helping 1MDB launder money. In Tim's guilty plea, he said that avoiding compliance was part of the Goldman Sachs culture. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most in all this were the Malaysian people, who were left with all the debts. 1MDB was sold as development projects that would be of benefit to all Malaysian people, but in reality, it was a cash grab. A big betrayal of the people. Even to this day, the FBI is still trying to piece everything together. Now, it's important to state that pretty much everyone involved, from Joe Low to Najib to Goldman Sachs, no one admits they are at fault. What is clear is this scam was an example of how the financial system can be so easily manipulated. Powerful people and big banks are incentivized not to ask too many questions as long as they're making money on these deals. And perhaps most crazy of all, Joe technically is still a free man, and you could say he got away with it, but there are many countries he can no longer visit, and he has no choice but to lay low, the exact opposite of what he wanted to do. Reports suggest that towards the end of this, Joe Low had gone from being quite a happy, relaxed guy to being very anxious and paranoid. Despite living the dream life, he seemed desperate to be liked and respected, which is perhaps why he kept chasing more and more money instead of quitting, which ultimately led to his downfall. This was the story of Crazy Joe. Hope that you enjoyed the video. Leave a like and subscribe for more. See you guys soon.